Okay, so as I said, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Gabriel M. Salman, who will speak on the topic of Islamic Shariah in theory and practice. Professor Salma teaches here in Beckton College at Fairleigh Dickinson, and he teaches Arabic language, beginning Arabic 1 and 2. For all of you students who haven't taken Professor Salma's class, listen up, because you can take Arabic. You can also take, in the fall, Arab culture and civilization. And plus, Professor Salma teaches selected studies in sociology. One course he taught was called Near East as Source of Western Culture, and another was Middle East Constitutional Laws and Islamic Shariah. I'm trying to say it right, okay? Professor Salma graduated second in his class from the Lebanese University School of Law back in 1970, and he was admitted to the Lebanese Bar Association of Beirut that same year. He's also an associate member of the New York State Bar Association and an associate member of the American Bar Association since 1999. Around the time that Professor Salma came to U.S., he was nominated to be a judge back in Lebanon, so he had to come here to a wedding of one of his family members, and while he was here, the war broke out over there, and his mother called and said, "Don't come back to be a judge. We're all coming to the U.S." Okay, so now they're all here in the U.S., safe and sound, I hope. So Professor Salma has had a lot of experience. He practiced law and supervised commercial contracts in the Middle East, and he's an expert consultant on Islamic finance and banking. He's also a lecturer on comparative international law, mainly the European Union law, the Islamic Sharia laws, and the Middle East constitutions. He's an expert consultant and lecturer on Islamic Sharia in the area of marriage and divorce. And he is particularly interested in women's rights and will be speaking, I think, on that topic today, women's rights in the Middle East. He's published many articles, several on the status of non-Muslim religious minorities in the Middle East and the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. Other articles are on the field of international law, both public and private, and have appeared in Europe and Middle East publications. One of Professor Salma's articles deals with the Iranian nuclear issue and the effect of sanctions. And most of these articles can be read online. Professor Salma is the editor of the International Law blog, where you can find these articles, and that would be at www.gabrielsalma.blogspot, that's blogspot.com. Not only does Professor Salma teach Arabic here, he speaks, of course, Arabic, English, French, Biblical, Aramaic, and Syriac, and has some knowledge of Spanish. So you could approach him in many languages, and he can respond. The book that is cited on the program today is the Quran, Misinterpreted, Mistranslated, and Misread, the Aramaic language of the Quran. It was published in 2006 by ID Books in Massachusetts, and it's on Amazon.com and Barnes & Noble, and if we don't have it here, we'll buy it here. And there's a couple of other books that Professor Salma is going to talk about that if we don't have them in the library, we will purchase them so that we'll have them if you're interested, especially you students who might be very interested to read more about the topic after today's presentation. Professor Salma has an upcoming book on Islamic marriage and divorce in the U.S. courts. That ought to be interesting. And so it is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Salma.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mariah. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. And I see two of my friends from Lebanon, Professor John Swade from Rutgers University, and Emil Najm, a Lebanese businessman. And thank you all for coming out this afternoon, and especially my students. Assalamu alaikum. Wa alaikum assalam. Very good. I'll be talking about the Islamic Sharia, We call it Islamic Sharia. Some in the United States, of course, we pronounce it Islamic Sharia or Islamic Shari'a, but the proper pronunciation is Islamic Shari'a. And Islamic Sharia means it's the right path for the Muslims. It's like when you have a boat sailing in the ocean, it goes straight, and therefore it is called the straight path. I'd like to draw your attention to something we have here, a kite. And flying kite is everywhere. It has been in the Middle East for centuries, and it was here in the United States as well. But it created problems during the 1990s in Afghanistan. You probably know that in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And for the following 10 years, there was a lot of bloodshed in that country where close to 1 million people lost their lives. And as a result of that, there were tens of thousands of children that needed someone to take care of them. In those days, you remember that there was a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. So when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan for the purpose of transforming that country into a communist country, the United States was helping those freedom fighters in those days. They were called mujahideen. The word mujahideen is from Arabic jihad, which is the fight for the sake of Allah, for the sake of God. And so the United States helped these mujahideen and convinced Saudi Arabia and Pakistan to take these children from Afghanistan, bring them into Pakistan, and teach them, open up schools for them. These schools came to be known as madrasa. Madrasa is an Arabic term, it means school. The etymology of the word is Syriac, madrashto. And the students who came from Afghanistan to learn in these schools came to be known as Taliban. From Arabic, talib means student. You would think that these students would learn sciences such as math, physics, chemistry, biology, history, geography, none of that. These students, these Talibans, were taught to learn how to memorize the Quran. There is a tradition that has been going on in the Middle East for the last 14 centuries, that it is more important to memorize the Quran than to understand its contents. If you were an Arab scholar and you were trying to understand the Quran, you probably would not understand half of it. And the reason for that, or one of the reasons, is because the language of the Quran, the classical Arabic, did not exist in the 7th century. The Arabic language of the Quran involves diacriticals, it involves vowel signs. All of these did not exist in those days. And therefore, many people concentrate more on memorizing the Quran than understanding it. So after the war in Afghanistan, the Soviet army left in 1989, and these people, these Taliban, came back to their country for the purpose of reconstructing Afghanistan. And so there was another civil war in Afghanistan after 1989, and finally, beginning in 1994, the Taliban took over the country. They started occupying major cities in the land. And the first thing they did, they issued a decree by which they considered the Islamic Sharia to be the law of the land. I think you could probably read some of the issues that were raised in those days and the things that Mullah Omar, who was and still is the leader of the Taliban, for example, they banned the music. You cannot hear the music. Even in your car, you cannot hear the music. They banned dancing and singing in wedding parties. They banned a lot of things. You cannot have a cassette tape in your car. You cannot have a CD in your car. Otherwise, you go to jail and your car would be impounded. And above all of these things, they banned kite flying. This kite, you cannot fly a kite in Afghanistan. And then they enacted into laws many regulations that would regulate the relationship between a female patient and her doctor. So, for example, a female patient cannot go by herself and see a male doctor. She has to be accompanied by what we call muharram. That means a person who is either her father, her brother, her sister, her husband, her son. Other than that, she cannot go visit a doctor. There has to be, even if there is someone with her, there has to be some kind of veil, a separation that separates her from the doctor. If she tells him, for example, I have a headache, he cannot check her stomach, he cannot check her back. He has to check only the areas where she tells him, I have a problem over there. I think you could read some of that here. All of this was done in the name of Islamic Sharia. And so the question is, what is Islamic Sharia? What are the components of the Islamic Sharia? Today in the Middle East, there are several countries that have Islamic Sharia as the law of the land. Pakistan is one of them, Iran is the other, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and in recent years, Nigeria introduced Islamic Sharia, and one of these Eastern African countries are starting to use Islamic Sharia. The Islamic Sharia has two major components, or two major elements, or two major sources. The first source is the Quran, and the second source is the Sunnah. The Sunnah means the sayings and the deeds attributed to the Prophet of Islam. This is a copy of the Quran. It consists of 114 chapters, and it talks about a lot of things. I'll be talking about them later on. And this is a copy of the Sunnah. These are the sayings and the deeds of the Prophet. They are written. There are 6 books that are considered canonical in Islam. This is the most important book after the Quran. So when you go to a court in the Middle East, a religious court, you take with you the Quran and you take with you this book, which is called Sahih al-Bukhari. And I'll be talking about this later on. Around the year 570, a person was born. His name was Muhammad. At the age of 25, he got married to a lady called Khadija. She was 15 years older than him, and she was a merchant. Mecca in those days was an important city throughout the ancient world in the Middle East. There are 2 reasons why Mecca was important. Number 1 is because it was a trade center. People would bring in their merchandise from South Arabia, from Yemen, from Hadramaut, and they would come in caravans, hundreds and hundreds of camels with all sorts of animals. They would carry these goods from Saudi Arabia and bring them into Mecca. And they would sell some of this product in Mecca and would buy other products. And then they would head north into Medina. Medina is around 270 miles north of Mecca. And from Medina, they would sell the merchandise and they would buy other stuff and they would go further north into Palestine. And from Palestine, they would go further north into Damascus. And from Damascus, they would go north into Harran. That's the birthplace of the family of Abraham. And from Harran, they would go into Urho or Urhoy. It's modern-day Urfa in Turkey. And from Turkey, they would go head east into modern-day Azakh. It has been the place where Alexander the Great crossed Tigris into Persia, where he defeated Darius. And from there, they would go into Persia and Afghanistan and Pakistan and India, all the way into China. And from China, they'll bring with them the silk. And that's why the road coming back and going to China was called the Silk Road. And there were several of these Silk Roads. If you happen to be in the Middle East, if you go to these areas, especially the areas of Tur Abdin, this mountainous region in southeast Turkey, you could still see these routes that extended all the way to China. And from China, they would bring the silk to the Mediterranean. And in the Mediterranean, they would dye it. And they would dye it mainly in the purple color, because purple was the sign of royalty. In modern days, these clergymen wear purple. So this merchandise then would go to Rome. And from Rome, it would go all over Europe. So Mecca was very important in those days. The other importance for Mecca was because in Mecca there is a stone. Islamic traditionalists say that stone is the place where Abraham tried to sacrifice his son Isaac, Ishaq. But others believe that that stone is a meteorite that fell thousands of years ago in Mecca. So Mecca was very important. Muhammad was born over there, he got married over there, and he started his religion over there. At the age of 40, the Prophet started getting revelations. These are divine revelations. He was in one of these caves around Mecca, where he started getting revelations from God through the angel Gabriel. In Arabic, they call him Jibril. And all these revelations were recorded or were memorized by his companions. And after his death, which happened in the year 632, they started worrying about these revelations, what to do with them. And finally, the third caliph, that means the third successor of the Prophet, ordered to put them in writing. And so they put all these revelations in a book, and they called that book Mushaf Uthman, or the Book of Uthman. When we say the Book of Uthman, we means the Bible. I'm sorry, we means the Quran. We means the Quran. The term Quran is Syriac term. In Syriac, we say Qur'an or Qur'an. When you go to these Eastern churches in the Middle East, especially the Syriac Orthodox Church and the Syriac Catholic Church and the Chaldean Church and the Church of the East, which is the Nestorian Church, or popularly known as the Assyrian Church, when you go over there, you hear these words, Qur'ano min Paulos Shliho, for example. Qira'a min Bulus al-Rasul, that means a reading from St. Paul. or a reading from Deuteronomy or reading from Revelations. So the word reading is used in the church. It has been used 600 years before the rise of Islam. And so the word Quran means Qur'an, it means a reading, and it could also means the call, because in Syriac we say Qur'an for call. Qur'an, like I call someone, Qur'an. And therefore, this is supposed to be Qur'an, yani, a call. The Quran talks about the worship of God. There is no God but one God, and in Arabic, the God is called Allah. And the word Allah has Aramaic roots in it, but this is another subject for another discussion. The Quran regulates the relationship between men and women. It calls for a dress code for women and for men. The Quran calls for the day of judgment, which is the last day. The Quran is a penal code or a criminal code because it has what we call hudud. It's a plural, a singular had that means a penalty. For example, someone steals, they cut his hand. This is in the Quran. وَالسَّارِقُ وَالسَّارِقَةُ تُقْطَعْ يَدَهُ. They cut the hand of the thieves. The Quran calls for, in case of death by murder, that blood money has to be paid. The Quran regulates the relationship of the Muslims with the non-Muslims, and it exerts some kind of, we call it jizya. It's an amount of money that non-Muslim has to pay for the Muslim because he's not Muslim. So it's like a penalty you pay when you live in an Islamic country. Actually, this is not used in modern times. It was taken out after the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire. I had worked in Saudi Arabia in early 70s, and I didn't have to pay the jizya in those days. They don't take it anymore. The second source of Islamic Sharia is called the Sunnah. The Sunnah means everything that the Prophet said and did. It was put in a book, in this book, and it's like an expansion to what is in the Quran. This is a reminder of what the Jewish did in their books. You probably know that when God gave Moses the laws, he also gave his descendants, the ability to interpret the laws of Moses according to future and changing situations. And therefore, when the written book was given to the Jewish people around the 13th and the 14th century BC, they had it written down, but they did not write down the interpretations of this book. This is called Talmud. It is composed of the Mishnah and the Gemara. Mishnah, that means the second. In Aramaic, we say Matno, that means the second, because the first would be the written Old Testament, the second would be the Mishnah, and the Mishnah has the Gemara in it. So when you combine the Mishnah and the Gemara in the Jewish tradition, you end up with the Talmud. And the Talmud is the oral traditions of the Jewish experience. So the Muslims wanted to do the same thing, 200 years after the death of the Prophet, they started writing down the deeds of the Prophet and the sayings attributed to the Prophet. And so they wrote them in this book. Now, there were, according to the author of this book, there were in his times, in the 9th century, close to 600 sayings that were attributed to the Prophet and his deeds. But they reached a point where they were not sure that all of these 600,000 sayings were the correct ones. Some of them were very hard to understand, and it was illogic to have them in a book, in a holy book. So the leader at that time, his name was Al-Mutawakkil, he asked a scholar to write down all these truthful sayings of the Prophet in one book. And so he came up with this book. Out of these 600,000 sayings, he was able to put in the book 7,320 sayings. 7,320. Out of these 7,320 in this book, there is half of them are repetitious. So you're talking about 3,500 sayings that they consider to be truthful. Now, we don't know what the criteria that this man did to find these and say these are truthful and ignore the rest. We don't have that criteria. But in the Islamic literature, which is very rich in writings, you could read them. I don't have them, but I use this one. When we go to a religious court, you use this one. You don't use the other stuff. So this is the Sunnah. So far we have the Quran, and the second one is the Sunnah. The third one is called the Ijma'. Now, let me draw your attention that these two books, the Quran and the Sunnah, are canonical and they are divine. And anytime you go to a court, you argue with them, this is the truth that you could present to the court to support your argument. There are other sources for the Islamic Sharia, but these other sources are not considered canonical. You could take them into consideration, but they are not mandatory. One of them is called the Ijma'. And Ijma' means the consensus of the scholars, Islamic scholars, on the interpretation of these two books, the interpretation of the Quran and the interpretation of the Hadith or the Sunnah. There were people who were studying these. You take these into consideration when you go to a court. This is called Ijma'. That means the consensus among the scholars. It's like relying on the judgments of other courts. When you go to an American court, you rely on the judgment. What did the court in California do in a case like this? In addition to the Ijma', we have another source. It's called Qiyas. And Qiyas is the fourth component of the Islamic Sharia. Again, it's not canonical, it's not divine. Qiyas means reasoning, analogy. For example, the Quran says you are not allowed to have alcoholic beverage. The reason for that, because alcoholic is toxicant. And so by reasoning, when a case comes to a judge and the defendant say, well, I did not have alcohol with me, but I had drugs with me. So by reasoning, the drugs are considered like alcohol because they are toxicants. This is called qiyas in the Islamic Sharia. And we use that very frequently in the religious course in the Middle East. In addition to that, there is a fifth element of the Islamic Sharia, and this is called urf. And urf means the traditions. A judge who is presiding on a case in Beirut has to take into consideration the traditions of the country, of the of the city and the country where this case is taking place. He cannot, for example, take the tradition of Damascus and implement it in a court in Beirut. He has to take the traditions of Beirut. This is called urf. So these traditions are considered important as long as they don't violate the Quran or the Sunnah. There is nothing that is accepted in the Islamic world where there is a violation to the Quran or the Sunnah. The Quran and the Sunnah are constitutional, and in many countries in the Middle East, you could be committing a blasphemy if you say anything bad about the Quran or the Sunnah. Actually, in the Middle Ages, a non-Muslim could not touch the Quran. And the non-Muslims could not learn the Quran. It was strictly designed for the Muslim community until the 20th century, when World War I started and the Ottoman Empire dismantled. It's during this time that people had access to the Quran and they could read it. And when the printing was available, they started printing the Quran. So nowadays, anybody could have the Quran. The Quran, I'm not supposed to carry it like that. I'm supposed to carry a glove to carry the Quran. But nowadays, everything is possible. You could carry the Quran. You don't have to be a Muslim. You could be a Jew. You could be a Christian. You could be Buddha, followers of Buddha. But this is, in general, the main elements of the Islamic Sharia. Now, there are 22 countries in the Middle East that are members of the Arab League. Every single constitution in the Middle East, except Lebanon, has a provision that says that the religion of the country should be Islam, or the laws of the country should be based on the Islamic Sharia. And in some constitutions, like the one in Syria, it says that the president has to be Muslim. This is, in general, everything that you need to know about Islamic Sharia. Now, there are two things that I would talk about in particular. One of them deals with the issues of women in the Middle East, and the other one deals with the situation of non-Muslims who are living in Islamic countries. As far as the woman is concerned, sometimes you read or you see on TV people appearing and they say Islam is very nice to women, Islam afforded them freedom, Islam gave them the right to own property. That's true. But as a lawyer dealing with cases involving Islamic divorce, I could tell you the situation is inequitable for women. Let me give you an example. According to the Quran, a Muslim could have 4 wives at the same time. And I've seen people who had, during their lifetime, 15 women, 15 wives. Like, okay, you could have 4 wives, but what he does, 5 years later, he'll divorce this one and marry the 6th. Then he would divorce the 2nd and marry the 7th. He would divorce the 3rd and marry the 8th. So at one time he has 4 wives, but in practice he has married more than 4 wives in his lifetime. And so you see them sometimes having 15, 20, 30, 40 children. Take, for example, Osama bin Laden. He had more than 50 brothers and sisters. It cannot be from 4 wives. His father maybe had 10, 15 wives. We don't know. But this is how it is. And I know cases in the United States, actually. I know a person who is married in the United States, but he has a wife in the Middle East. And so he travels to the Middle East frequently. This guy is a wealthy man. And when I ask him, how do you do that? He said, well, I have the money. I could have a wife over there. I could have a wife in the United States. Now, why is this important? It's because we are seeing these issues in the court system in the United States. In Islam, the marriage, for example, is a contract. You draw a contract between the man and the guardian of the wife. Every woman in Islam must have a guardian, and that guardian has to be her, before marriage, has to be her father, and then the guardianship goes to the grandfather, and then to the uncles, and then to the brothers, and then to the cousins. There is a list. The Quran lists the names of these people that should be guardians for the woman. So the guardian would take care of this contract marriage. The most important provision in the contract marriage is the mahar, where he promises to give his wife a mahar. It's like dowry, but dowry is what the woman contributes to the marriage. A mahar is what the husband contributes to the marriage. So this dowry could range from $1 to $1 million. I have seen cases, divorce cases, in the United States. Actually, I have a case right now in California where the husband promised his wife with $20 if there is a divorce. And after 28 years of marriage, he divorced his wife. He went to Lebanon, and he is now in the process of getting a divorce paper from there. He sent her a check for $20. In the meantime, she helped him develop the business. They have a very successful business in California. His assets are estimated to be $1.5 million. So instead of paying her half of that to be equitable, he goes to Lebanon and he sends her a check for $20. And he said, this is a contract. And when she called me, I said, no, this is not a civil contract. The judge and the lawyer thought that this is a civil contract that she signed on the paper. I said, no, this is a religious contract, and we're not allowed to talk religious in the courts. This is violation to the First Amendment. And so now we're litigating that in California. Another lady is from Sudan. Her husband, they live in Texas. Her husband goes to Sudan and get a divorce decree from Sudan. And this time, the mahar was only $5. So this guy spent probably $3,000 to go over there, go in a hotel. All he has to do just get 2 witnesses, and his wife is divorced. So he goes, he gets 2 witnesses, and he gets a divorce paper. We're litigating that in Texas. In Connecticut, a person calls his attorney in Pakistan and tells him, I want to divorce my wife. He said, do you have any witnesses? He said, yeah, I have 2 witnesses standing next to me. He said, okay, let me talk to them. So he talks to them. Yeah, this guy is divorcing his wife, and so the wife is divorced. So we are litigating these issues in the courts in the United States. This is, of course, a new field in the United States, but hopefully we could bring back some sense to all of this stuff. The other thing is in the matters related to the child custody. In Islam, the children belong to the father alone. They don't belong to a wife. If there is a divorce, the wife must bring the children to the husband for custody. If the child is a boy, at the age of 7, she has to bring him to his father. If the father doesn't want the boy, she cannot keep him. She has to bring him to his grandfather. If the grandfather is deceased, take him to the uncle. As long as he is a patriarchal person, guardian, the kids don't belong to the wife. The daughters also belong to the husband at the age of 9. When the daughter reaches the age of 9, she has to give the daughter to the father. Actually, we are now litigating a case in Canada where the wife took the child at the age of 6 to India, and we're trying to bring him back into Canada. One more thing that I'd like to talk to is inheritance. The rule in Islam, according to the Quran, is that the daughter gets half the shares of the boy. So for example, if a man deceased and has a daughter and a son, let's say he leaves $90,000, $30,000 goes to the daughter, and $60,000 goes to the son. This is the formula. وَلِلْذَكَرْ مِثْلُ حَظِّ الْأُنْثَيَيْنِ. Right, John? The daughter gets half of what the son gets. I think I covered most of the things that's concerned with Islamic Sharia, and I'd like to take your questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we're going to open it up to questions.
Why do you think that imams are, if you agree, so reluctant to speak out against what they consider to be elements of distortion in Sharia law?
Elements of distortion. Look, we have to agree that Islam is not just a religion. Islam is a way of life. I mean, if you look into the Islamic Sharia books, there are volumes like this. It tells you about how to clip your nail. It tells you how to comb your hair. It even tells you how to use the toilet. There are so many specifics in the Islamic Sharia. Some of them are acceptable in modern days, but some of them are not. And therefore, an imam who is a leader in his community, he doesn't have any interest to dig and see these unlikable things and talk about them in public. For example, I have seen many mullahs, sheikhs or imams, they lie on their affidavit. They are not telling the truth because it might hurt the feelings of the community. I mean, you could be a Muslim, but living in America, it's fine. You're like any other American. But you don't want to hear about certain things that are not acceptable in your religion. And I think that's what they are trying to do. For example, in this book, there is a saying that the Prophet said, kill anybody who changes, kill he who changes his religion. So what do? You carry a revolver, and every time you see a Muslim who became a Christian, you just kill him? You cannot do that. So they don't want to talk about that, but in the Middle East, they do it. Let me give you another example. How about honor killing? I know a case where the person in Jordan heard his friend as saying that, I saw your sister talking to that guy on the corner of the street. So he stabbed his sister. And they call that honor killing. Actually, we have several cases right now in the United States under litigation. In the United States, a guy probably a year ago killed 2 daughters because they were wearing jeans, because they were not wearing the Islamic dress. And some of these things are not even in the Quran, like the hijab. You see them sometimes all over the Middle East. You see women wearing hijab. It's not in the Quran, and it's not even in the Sunnah. This was the creation of the mullahs, of the imams that you're talking about. And I remember one time I was in Saudi Arabia, and I saw these mullahs. They call them religious police. They cut the hair of a person walking in the streets because his hair was a little bit long. And in those days, my hair was long, and all of a sudden someone follows me. He wants to cut my hair in the middle of the road, and I scared to death. I was just running from him. So how could you tell how many inches your hair has to be? Mullah Omar in Afghanistan determined that it's 4 inches. You could have your beard up to 4 inches. But if you don't have beard, you go to jail. And he does that according to Islamic Sharia. Yes.
We do know that there are many sects in Islam, just like in any other religion. The Shia, the Sunni, and the Zaydis, and the Ismailis, and so many others. Do they all apply the same thing, the Sunnah, or do they prefer Sunnah over Quran, or Qiyas over Uruf, or things like that?
No. In the Sunni Islam, there are four schools of thought in the Sunni. You see, after the spread of Islam in the Middle East during the 7th century, there was the issue of who is going to be, after the death of the Prophet, who is going to take over Islam? Is it his cousins, his family? He didn't have sons. In Islam, the traditions in the Middle East is that when the father is deceased, his son takes over. But since the Prophet did not have any son, he didn't have son, so he had a cousin, his name was Ali. Ali was married to the daughter of the Prophet, and at the same time, he was the cousin of the Prophet. And it's tradition over there in the Middle East. In modern days, you see cousins are marrying each other. And so it didn't spare my family. My cousin in Sweden did the same thing, and I didn't know about that until late. So what to do? He's dead. They elected someone who is not related. There is no blood relation. That person was Abu Bakr. And then after his death, they elected another one, Omar. And then after Omar, Uthman. Ali, who was the cousin of the Prophet, was supposed to be the guy to inherit the Islam and be the leader. And so there was a split, and it was a bloody split between the Shia and the Sunni. And now there is differences between these two groups. Some of them believe, the Shia believe that the Quran that we read now is not a complete Quran, that there are a lot of many chapters that are missing from this Quran. If those chapters were in this Quran, then they believe that Ali would have been the first successor of the Prophet. These are called the Shia of Ali, the followers of Ali. And so they have their own, they use the same Quran, the same one that we're using, the Sunni are using, and they are using a different. You see, this one is the Sunnah. This is only for the Sunni traditions. For the Shia, they have their own book that talks about what the Prophet said. And sometimes here you find differences between this one and what the Shia believe in. And so the Sunnis, over the years, they had 4 schools of thought. One of them is the Hanbali, which is the precursor of the Wahhabi in Saudi Arabia, which is the strictest form of Islam. Then you have the Hanafi, which was in other areas under the Ottoman Empire. They used the Hanafi school of jurisprudence or school of thought. Then you have the Maliki, which was used in Medina and in North Africa. And you have the Shafi'i, which is used in Indonesia and in the Far East. In the Shia, they have 3 major schools. One of them is the Ithnai Ashar, or the 12ers. These are the rulers of Persia belong to this group, the 12ers, because in the Shia tradition, they believe in Muhammad, in the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, and they believe in the descendants of Muhammad, like Ali, his cousin, and then after Ali comes Hassan, and after Hassan comes Hussein. So there are 12 imams that came after the Prophet. They believe in these 12 imams. That's why they call them the 12ers. And they believe that the last imam disappeared in the Middle Ages. He lives somewhere, and he is going to be back on the judgment day. Ahmadinejad is one of those groups who believe in this theology, that the Imam is waiting until some sort of upheaval, a war, something happened in the world where this Imam is going to appear, and that would be the day of judgment. There are also, in addition to the 12ers, they believe in the Yazidi. Yazidi is another group, and the third one is the Ismaili, and most of the Ismailis are in Yemen and in other areas.
How does the class system affect Amir and Hassan's relationship?
The Pashtun is the largest tribe in Afghanistan. They spread between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And when the Taliban came into power, they were members of the Pashtun community. And therefore, you see, the tribal, you have to live in the area to understand the tribal life. Sometimes they hate each other. The Middle East was based on attacks. You attack your enemy. You attack your neighbor. You attack your friend. They called them ghazu, ghazawat. That means this family would attack this family on something minor, probably because they took more water from the land than they're supposed to, or they use more land to plant in it, or they kidnapped a girl from this tribe, so the whole tribe started fighting the other one. They involved politics in this, and the Taliban were part of this politics.
Okay, we're going to take one more question.
Hi. I had a question. What happens in a situation, what does the Islamic Sharia provide for a Muslim woman who immigrates from, say, Turkey or any other Muslim land, comes over to the United States with her family at a very young age. She becomes an American citizen, but she retains her Muslim religion, although not really practicing. She then meets a non-Muslim man that she would like to marry. First question is, what does the Sharia provide for her? And secondly, what does the Sharia say about the non-Muslim man that you would like to marry?
The Quran is vague about if the woman could marry a non-Muslim. But the interpretation of the Quran, that means the Sunnah, it states that a Muslim man could marry a non-Muslim woman. For example, a Muslim man could marry a Christian or a Jew, and she could keep her religion. He cannot enforce her to change her religion. But if he were to marry a Hindu, for example, then he is not allowed to do so unless she converts into Islam. But as far as women is concerned, a Muslim woman cannot marry a non-Muslim. A Muslim woman, I know cases in the Middle East where a woman who was trying to marry a non-Muslim was killed because it's illegal to do so. So a Muslim woman should marry a Muslim man. And this has become a problem in the United States. There are nice women coming from the Middle East here, but they don't find the right Muslim man. They cannot marry a non-Muslim unless they change their religion. And then there is another problem with that. The Prophet says, kill he who changes his religion. So what do you do? I think there was a case in the United States where the father killed his daughter because of suspicion that she's going to marry a non-Muslim. Thank you very much. Yeah.